We're going to talk to or hear from Jo Bartosch from the United Kingdom first. She's a journalist. She's going to give an overview of coverage in the UK. Jo Bartosch is a widely published journalist at the forefront of the fight against transgenderism. She has a background in feminist organising and activism. In addition to articles in world-leading outlets, Jo is lead reporter for Lesbian and Gay News. So thank you so much for coming on, and over to you, Jo.
I'm going to share my analysis of how we have come to a point where reputable newspapers will refer to men as if they're women. And I'll open with an overview of the key points and the key players. I'll explain then a bit about the editor's code and how that's been undermined by trans lobby groups. And I'll conclude with some of my own experiences of trying to tell the truth and some of the compromises I'm sometimes pressed to accept. So in 2013, a man by the name of Lucy Meadows killed himself. And he was a teacher. And in the year before his death, he had been the subject of numerous articles, including a Daily Mail column entitled, "He's not only in the wrong body, he's in the wrong job." And the piece was written by journalist Richard Littlejohn, and it argued that Genders was entitled to have what he termed gender reassignment surgery, but that it was selfish to expect his primary age class to accept his new identity. Meadows complained to the regulatory body, which at the time was the Press Complaints Commission. It's now called IPSO, and they ruled that his privacy had been breached. And later that year, he killed himself. Now, his suicide note made absolutely no mention of press intrusion, but the coroner singled out the negative press in the Daily Mail. Spurred on by The Guardian and Independent, transgender activists seized upon Meadows' suicide. And a petition calling for Littlejohn's sacking was circulated, garnering 240,000 signatures, and a vigil was organised. Now, in the same year, journalist Suzanne Moore wrote a polemic in the New Statesman in which she said that women were tired of the expectation that the ideal body shape was that of a Brazilian transsexual. And Moore's was the first public scalp claimed by trans activists on Twitter, so they descended en masse and forced her from the site. Judy Burchell was furious on behalf of her friend Suzanne Moore, and she wrote an article in The Observer entitled "Transsexuals Should Cut It Out," which was characteristically provocative, and she referred to trans-identified men as bedwetters in bad wigs and dicks in chicks' clothing. And it prompted an absolute tsunami of rage. There were 800 complaints to IPSO, and the editor, John Mulholland, apologised and removed it from the Observer's website, though it was republished on the Telegraph. So at that stage, IPSO rejected the whingers and upheld Burchell's right to state her opinion. But tension between trans activists and journalists had been simmering for around a decade before Burchell, Littlejohn and Moore. So in 2004, Julie Bindel wrote an article for The Guardian called "Gender Benders Beware," and it was about the sexism and the homophobia underpinning transgenderism. Afterwards, she apologised for the tone, but she still drew extreme criticism, and 4 years later, trans activists led by the fragrant Ros Kavanagh protested her nomination for the 2008 Stonewall Journalist of the Year award. So persistent complaints against newspapers led to changes in practice. And speaking with those who've got more professional experience than me, I have it on good authority that following the campaign against Littlejohn, the Daily Mail decided to employ a trans-identified man as a sensitivity reader, or what some journalists disparagingly refer to as a woke whisperer. So it's his job, or was his job, to approve copy on so-called trans issues before publication. And in 2015, the group Trans Media Watch, which is run by a man called Helen Belcher, took aim at the Sun. And in response, the Sun also agreed to have copy put before a woke whisperer. Obviously, they still had page 3. So that might not sound significant, and I doubt many of us in this webinar are regular readers of The Sun or The Mail, but it's worth bearing in mind that these papers have huge readerships and tend to still both reflect and create mainstream public opinion on most issues. And once the scold's bridle had been fitted to those on the right, the left-leaning press had no space other than to fully embrace transgenderism. So the Communist Morning Star remained an exception for a few years, but it caved under pressure from the unions, who threatened to withdraw funding from it in around 2020 after objecting to a cartoon by Stella Perrett. So from around 2010, the press regulator began to meet with transgender lobby groups, alongside Belcher of Transmedia Watch. Stephen Whittle of Press for Change demanded changes to coverage. And under the weight of this sustained criticism, IPSO updated their trans guidance, all the while Stonewall and others were rolling out training across statutory bodies, which by 2015 included the T. So it should be remembered that at this time, the press was full of stories celebrating Bruce's miraculous transformation into Caitlin. And added to this, mainstream pop feminism was weaponized against women. So in the early 2010s, there did seem to be a resurgent interest in feminism, but some of the newly formed groups, like UK Feminista, routinely platformed transgender activists. So consequently, the careers of trans-identified journalists like Paris Lees and Jane Fay were turbocharged. They claimed to both be feminists and trans, thereby ticking two trendy Guardian boxes. So by 2015, the tone of coverage was directed by the woke whisperers on the right, and mainstream feminism had been co-opted and weaponized by the left. So there were very few exceptions, but ultimately the left-leaning press lacked a cogent feminist analysis. So financial changes prompted by digitization have also fed into this. The Guardian opted not to have a paywall online, and that means that it staked its future on maximizing its audience in America. So this means that The Guardian now competes with the New York Times for affluent liberal readers on both US coasts. Hence, last year, The Guardian ran 3 disgraceful articles which suggested the Black Christian woman who highlighted the WeSpa scandal in Los Angeles had made unsubstantiated allegations, and that the story provided clear evidence of the links between anti-trans and far-right movements. It then transpired that a trans-identified male who was a registered sex offender had been at the spa. The Guardian and others nonetheless spread this fake news in part to placate their woke American readers. But the problems at the Guardian had been rumbling on for some time. So editor-in-chief Kath Biner has spent years appeasing Owen Jones and his 1 million Twitter followers, as arguably his personal brand has enough clout to impact on The Guardian. Tensions boiled over in 2020 when Suzanne Moore was the subject of a letter condemning transphobia, which was signed by 338 Guardian employees. Eventually, and quite understandably, she left. A few brave women have hung on there, but from what I understand, the atmosphere is pretty much like North Korea. So in a bizarre twist, by continuing to simply report issues with balance and allowing journalists to use their own discretion, The Times has become the most radical mainstream paper to report on the attack on women's rights. And this is largely thanks to the sterling work of columnist Janice Turner. So to summarize how things have changed, repeated complaints to IPSO hit the press at a time of substantial financial and social change spurred by the digital shift. Consequently, trans activists have moved from a vicious and vocal fringe on the outside to sitting in newsrooms and signing off copy. Moreover, at the same time as lobby groups captured IPSO, they began to dictate what language is used throughout institutions, making it much harder to, for example, to accurately report on court cases where a trans-identified male was in the dock. So to step back from the specifics, the overarching purpose of the Fourth Estate, the press, is to assist democracy by scrutinising and reporting on the actions of the government and the judiciary. But of course, that depends on journalists being free to report the truth. The editor's code are clauses to which registered outlets are expected to adhere, and they're overseen by IPSO. The first clause in the editor's code demands accuracy in reporting, but obviously headlines such as "man gives birth" or "woman convicted of rape" are not accurate. They're signifiers of faith. But such phrases are in accordance with the IPSO trans guidelines, which asks writers questions including, if known, have you used the pronouns the individual uses to describe themselves in your story? Is the individual status relevant? And does the article include unnecessary information such as irrelevant references to previous identities, publication of pictures of individuals pre-transition, or references to medical details? So the guidance, developed with input from trans lobby groups, is in an attempt to reduce complaints, makes a mockery of the duty to report facts accurately as outlined in the editor's code. So how this works in practice is interesting. Last month, a local newspaper ran a story with the headline, "Scott flashed her penis and used sex toy in public, leaving onlookers shocked." So journalistic nous, and indeed women's often suppressed gut instinct, would suggest that the trans identity of a sex offender is almost always relevant, because we know that adopting a trans identity requires core beliefs which are often held by the most dangerous males. So the idea that womanhood can be possessed and worn by men as a sexy costume can only be believed by men who do not see women as full autonomous human beings. So it's not really massively surprising that such men are likely to pose an elevated risk. And I think a lot of journalists regularly reporting on crime would instinctively recognise that pattern. So return to the lovely lady in Scotland flashing her penis. My hunch is that the wording here was quite deliberate, and that the headline writer was following IPSO guidance in order to highlight how ludicrous it is. So the backlash online was predictable and it was glorious, but obviously it's IPSO who need to be made to feel the shame of muzzling outlets in this way, not just the communications assistant who runs the social media accounts of the outlet. So I suspect the impasse between facts that journalists are obligated to report and the demands of transgenderism will only really be resolved by the threat or reality of litigation and continued public pressure. And I know people can be very critical of the press, but I can honestly tell you from my experience, most editors and journalists really do care about accuracy and honesty. But the pressure is intense and free online content has collapsed rates of pay. In some cases, this has led to what's referred to as churnalism. So those I know who work at national newspapers are sometimes set a target of 6 stories a day. And that's very different from, for example, what I do, where I average maybe 1 or 2 opinion pieces of about 850 words each day or two. So when you think about these pressures in newsrooms, it's understandable that when a charity like Mermaid sends a well-crafted media release, sometimes to a time-pressed journalist whose expertise is probably in an area totally outside of feminist politics, they just copy and paste it without really having time to reflect. So thankfully, our side are now catching on to this and forging relationships with the media, but a lot of damage has already been done. I used to run a feminist group called Chelt Fems. And as part of that, I used to write a regular column on feminism in my local town of Cheltenham. And it turned out that I had a talent for writing, so I thought I'd try my luck by pitching to national newspapers. And most of my pitches were ignored, and I should explain that I've never worked in the newsroom, I don't have any formal training, and even now, it kind of feels like doing an apprenticeship without ever setting foot in an office. So my first piece in a mainstream outlet was in 2017, and it was for The Independent, and it was about treatments for children with gender dysphoria. And it was the first critical piece of its kind, and it sparked a huge response, both positive and negative. So you can see on the slide here, the charming chap at the top, that's Mark Helen or Natasha Kennedy, and he's a Goldsmiths academic. And he was so offended, he wrote an incoherent blog, excerpts of which you can see, accusing me of driving children to suicide. And I was retrospectively asked to amend the article by The Independent so that it was in line with WPATH guidelines. And I told them to start off. But in the few years since that was published, things have changed. Last year, almost every day, I was contacted by editors asking me specifically to write about the attack on women's rights by transgenderism. So now many people are writing about it, which I guess is a good thing, though it does mean that the requests have tailed off. With the exception of the Observer, I think that the right-left split is probably more entrenched than ever. I've pretty much given up pitching to the left because there's just no point. And to be honest, I do get a bit of flack for writing for right-wing publications, but if they're prepared to publish a radical feminist, I'm prepared to work with them. And day to day, sometimes I do struggle with terminology because how involved editors are in the writing process varies by the outlet, but often they don't understand why, for example, it's important to refer to a man as a man and not a trans woman. So most outlets also have a house style, and sometimes I have to balance whether it's worth conceding linguistic points to get an important message out. And as an aside, I often get quite a lot of kickback for headlines or photos or tweets that are used to promote my work. And I just want everyone to know I never write those. Journalists never get to write those. So opinion journalism exists in quite a fraught space where pragmatism competes with ideology. And sometimes that does mean pissing everyone off, but I think it's vital. And today, writing is my living. But there are three main things that motivate me because it really isn't their terrible rate of pay. So firstly, it's because I get cross about lies that are being uncritically shared, and it just drives me batty. And I think if I didn't vent in opinion pieces, I'd just implode. Secondly, it's because I want an accurate record of this period in time. So I often like to imagine feminist historians of the future uncovering with horror a time when men were referred to as women and Teen Vogue promoted pornography to girls. And thirdly, I want to reach people who might not consider themselves feminist or even politically engaged, and just to appeal to their innate sense of right and wrong and to spark a desire to make change.